In the workplace, in the classroom, in personal relationships, and everyday life, being an ally means being in tune with the people around you, respecting their views, listening to them, empathizing and caring. It means taking personal responsibility to provide support through actions, even if you don't look like the person or group you're advocating for or share the same background. You need to take on the struggle as your own and truly understand where they're coming from to give their movement, big or small, a voice. So, to sum it up, the guide to allyship. Take on the struggle as your own. Transfer the benefits of your privilege to those who lack it. Amplify voices of the oppressed before your own. Acknowledge that even though you feel pain, the conversation is not about you. Stand up even when you feel scared. Own your mistakes and decenter yourself. Understand that your education is up to you and no one else. I'm Stony Brook University's Chief Diversity Officer and Vice President of Equity and Inclusion, Judith Brown Clarke, and I'm excited to be your host and panelist for the second podcast of our series, Beyond the Expected, Bridging the Racial Divide. Today we'll be talking about being an ally, what it is, how to do it, why it's so important in today's racially, ethnically, politically divided society. We will get to speak with two Stony Brook experts who will share their views and expertise. Dr. Adam Gonzalez from his perspective as Director of Behavioral Health, and Juliet Passer as a practicing New York attorney, Corporate Diversity Director, and Stony Brook University's professor who teaches courses on diversity, is also the Board Leadership Fellow with the National Association of Corporate Directors, based in the U.S., as well as Women on Boards, based in the U.K. and Australia. In a slight variation from our normal format, this is going to be more of an organic roundtable discussion. Rather than me asking questions of our guests, I will also participate as a panelist with my perspective and personal experiences around allyship. So, let's get the ball rolling. Viewers and listeners, please join the conversation with us. Through Facebook Live, we will address your comments as real-time possibilities. So you type in and we will respond to your questions. Let's begin. Dr. Adam Gonzalez, would you like to share a little bit about allyship, or share a little bit about yourself and what you do, and then we'll kind of tie that into allyship.
Definitely. Thanks, Judy, for having me on today. It's a privilege to be here. So I'm a clinical psychologist in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Health, and I also serve as the Director of Behavioral Health and direct the Mind Body Clinical Research Center. At Stony Brook, I wear a number of different hats, including chairing our Faculty Diversity Ambassadors Council, as well as co-chairing our LGBTQ committee. So more recently, I've been heavily entrenched in a lot of the diversity inclusion work, and I think now, in particular, allyship is really, really important, that we look to one another around how we can help one another and how we can stand up for one another. In reflecting on allyship, a quote from Maya Angelou came to mind that I wanted to share, and it's, "I think we all have empathy. We may not have enough courage to display it." And I think that really taps into the importance of talking about allyship and raising the bar a little bit higher than just understanding and being supportive to one another, but how can we help others to advocate and really have a voice for those that may not be able to speak for themselves at times.
Thank you so much. Juliet, can you share a little bit about your background and just kind of give us a brief overview of how you see allyship?
Thanks, Judy. I'm delighted to be here, and it's wonderful to be back on campus after so many months. I am passionate about inclusion, cultural diversity, and allyship because I think they're completely interconnected. And I'm delighted to share some thoughts with you after countless conversations over the last 20 years, from the boardroom to the classroom. Privileged to be here. Looking forward to our discussion.
One of the things I think is really interesting is we think of allyship in a way of giving somebody else something, and we don't really wrap our mind around that. We're gaining the same level of professional development and being a good colleague or friend or teammate or colleague. So it's not just giving the other person what they need. It's you being receptive and learning the skills and the appropriate language and attention that things a lot of people need. One of the things I think is really interesting when people try to figure out what is a good ally, and the ally is a term that is being used here, but it's very similar to what it means to be empathetic. I think people get empathetic and sympathetic mixed up. Empathetic is an understanding of a person's perspective, position, feelings, and thoughts. It doesn't mean you have to agree. It just means that you step outside of your judgment and your perspective to be open to hearing what that person is going through, how they may be perceiving things. And that seems to be kind of a sticking point sometime, I think, in being a good ally, is that I have to agree or I have to change the way I think.
And also parsing out the difference between sympathy too. So
Yes.
sympathy being more so feeling sorry for somebody else, where empathy is really getting in the trenches there with them, feeling that pain with them, and also trying to figure out how can I help elevate that person? How can I help that person cope with this current situation? So just to point out some of those differences there.
And one thing I found that allyship is commonly misunderstood. So if you would allow me, I think allyship is a very fluid relationship, and it's completely bidirectional. So the one who is allied and the one who is an ally, it's a relationship of giving to each other and supporting each other. And I think what's missing in a lot of allyship discussions is that, first of all, ally is a verb. So just talking about it or putting a post on social media supporting a cause, it's not allyship. It really is doing. And the other thing I do want to bring up is that allyship is also brings a lot of responsibility. If you become an ally, don't turn your back, because that's betrayal. So allyship is a very powerful concept and a very powerful tool, but use it with care. Make sure that you understand why you're doing it and what your purpose is.
Another piece that both of you brought up that I think should be shared is intersectionality. When we define who we are, we bring our whole self. And our whole self is not, like, I'll say for myself, I'm not just African American. I'm not just female. I'm not just almost 6 feet tall. I'm not just a person that has higher education, who is in a marriage, who has children, I bring all of that. And so there are many times in a conversation where I vacillate between verb and noun, where I am the ally and sometimes I am being allied. I think we tend to think of power and privilege as the one that allies others, but in any way we look at it, at some point in time, we're the power and privileged, and we're giving that allyship to someone that is within a different perspective.
Yeah, I was just going to say, as a white, gay, Hispanic man, I also share that experience with both serving as an ally to others as well as being allied and accepting the others' allyship for myself. And that's really important to have that bidirectionality that we were talking about as well.
Absolutely. It also occurs to me that, first of all, anyone can be an ally. And because it is such a fluid concept, it changes. So I can tell you from personal experience, I certainly could have used an ally when I stepped into that first boardroom meeting with 10 angry men from 3 countries. So, then life changes, and now I'm in a position of privilege and power and influence, not only as a director. It's a given, as corporate directors, we do have a lot of privilege, power, and influence, but as an educator. And this is another point I want to make. As educators, we are in a position of privilege, power, and influence. Let's use it for a good cause and use it carefully.
I think it's important to note that being an ally and being allied is actually professional development. Your ability to really develop these tools, both in the position of being a good ally, which is being a good colleague, which any employer would love, as well as being open enough to be allied. And so it's not just a good thing to do. It actually creates culture, synergy, and effective and productive environments. Would either of you like to speak about that?
Well, I was just thinking too about like organizational allyship, right? Like Stony Brook University as a premier academic medical center in the world, and here on Long Island, our responsibility to be allies to the community around us, and how do we set that bar as an organization, and also as leaders within the organization? What do we bring forth to help the community?
Right, so that brings another thought to my mind, is that allyship is very much part of mentorship. And so just as you said, professional development, but it also mentorship all around us in our personal lives, in our educational lives, in our professional lives. It's a concept of actually learning about others, being open yourself to share your life, and then to be flexible and open-minded enough so that we can embrace the intersectionality of our personalities, if you will.
So that kind of brings me to, we've kind of gone from our diversity plan to the diversity action plan for high performance. And the reason we're calling it for high performance is because usually something is determined as high performance because it's a stretch goal that's difficult for people to meet. And once you meet it, it's considered high performance because it's at the highest level of accomplishment. That's how I see Stony Brook. If we can operationalize this, give people the tools, the techniques, the language, the behavior, this is the kind of thing that really creates the structure for people to feel embraced, heard, valued, and when somebody's at full capacity, they bring every aspect of their time and talent, which is where innovation is creative, and opportunities to really collaborate on things that require interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary types of talent. So, and I love the fact that that you kind of wrapped it around that there's allyship within an individual perspective, but there's also collective allyship. So how does allyship drive innovation in professional development or professional high performance?
Mm-hmm. Well, it makes me think about like having different collaborators, especially within the organization, how we can utilize our own individual skills and expertise, as well as then learn from others, and then combine those skills and expertise. And that's where we see, I think, a lot of innovation, novelty come from that. That first step is actually taking that step to learn about one another and to truly understand who each other is as a person, as well as then you take that a step further with their academics and research and scholarly work to see how that collaboration can actually play out.
I'm so glad that we're calling our diversity plan high performance. So I have two thoughts about it. I'm really pleased to hear that. One is that in the corporate world, we've already established that diversity is not only the right thing, it's the smart thing. We know that diverse teams are more innovative, in fact, by 20%. And we also know that diversity of thought is very important. Diversity is a very complex topic. So diverse teams are also 30% more likely to identify risk and to manage it. In the corporate setting, that's very important. But what we have also discovered, and that's where our high performance plan comes in, is that top-down approach is not enough for diversity. And that's where diversity and allyship are completely intertwined. I think that allyship and diversity is every person's business, and it's a commitment to open yourself up, to understand the differences, to embrace the differences, and allow others to be diverse and different and creative. So this is why allyship and diversity are very, very close to me. And at some point, I do want to share an interesting piece of information for everyone who is listening, is that we actually do have Universal Declaration on Diversity, which, if you would indulge me one minute, I would like to tell you, it's a very interesting document. UNESCO actually enacted this document in response to 9/11. So this is basically a statement of all member states of the United Nations acknowledging how important diversity is. It's a very short document, only 12 articles. I really recommend that everybody looks at it. If I could, I'm just going to read the first article to you, because I think it summarizes in the most beautiful and profound way why diversity is the thing. So here's what it says. The first article is entitled Identity, Diversity, and Pluralism. Culture takes diverse forms across time and space. The diversity is embedded in the uniqueness and plurality of the identities of the groups and societies making up humankind. As a source of exchange, innovation, and creativity, cultural diversity is as necessary to humankind as biodiversity is to nature. In this sense, the common heritage of humanity and should be recognized and affirmed for the benefit of present and future generations. There you have it. Diversity is the way of life for us.
The thing it's always interesting to me that, of course, I get a lot of research, as we all do, and I have not seen one research article or piece of information that has said diversity and inclusion doesn't drive and have a direct correlation to efficiency, effectiveness, innovation, productivity, and so on. So, knowing that, hearing that article, and knowing that there's times within our entire, if you look at how as a nation we were created with this nation of the Statue of Liberty, let everyone come, and we embrace who we are, and we leverage that. Knowing that, why are we having this conversation?
Yeah, I think some people, unfortunately, in our society and perhaps around the world, some people choose to embrace only certain people. And I think we're here to talk about ways to get people to really embrace one another, all people. And that really starts with having a sense of awareness to our own individual biases around our own judgments that we may make, whether they be conscious or unconscious, and really trying to have those unconscious biases uncovered so that they're more conscious, and then we can actually take steps to correct and work on that. Those are some of the interferences that I see in making those connections with one another and serving as an ally to one another.
That is so true. To me, of course, we should have had this conversation, and it's wonderful that we're having it now, better later, right? But I think one of the problems that we need to recognize, one of the causes of lack of diversity and misunderstanding of allyship is unexamined behavior. I'm convinced after, having worked in 50 countries and serving on the boards for 20 years that we are what we think. And we have the power of channeling our thinking towards positive versus negative. So this is why this conversation has to happen, but it has to start with each one of us. You kind of have to look at your environment, examine your professional network, examine your professional and personal relationships, and ask yourself a question. What are my blind spots? Is my natural environment diverse? And then if the answer is no, you should work on it. And if the answer is yes, then you should move on, become an ally, and help new generations on that path.
I think what you're speaking about touches on the process of developing as an ally, right? So it's kind of the how-to. So I think you gave some really great advice in terms of looking externally at your network, looking who you're collaborating with, looking who your friend circles may look like. And then there's also the internal process as well, right? And so I like to promote mindfulness, and mindfulness is all about the attention and awareness to our current experiences, both our thoughts, our emotions, physical sensations. And the more that we can tap into how we're feeling right now, the more that we can slow down, process what's going on to make effective decisions. The other really important piece of mindfulness is being aware and in the present moment in a non-judgmental way, so that we can see what's going on and not react to that this is bad or this is good, but otherwise it just is. And then use that information for then positive steps to take to examine our viewpoints and then further develop how we can be allies to others in that way.
So now I'm going to go a little deeper. We all know how this is a good idea. So let's talk a little bit about some of the things that actually make it more complex. So I'm going to share a little something. And I thought about this last night and like the last 2 nights, and I'm thinking, okay, how much do I share? Because I think, people see where you are. They don't know your path. They don't know your history. They make assumptions that if I'm meeting you where you are, I must have come along your same path. So let me share this. I am 2 generations from slave. My grandparents were born just depending on which side. One was born in slavery, one was born free. And so as I grew listening to my grandparents, a lot of things that I was taught as a person had to do with literal safety. So it wasn't just, here's some things you need to do to follow directions or so on. It's like, there's a reason when I rode my bike, when that street light came on, I had to be on the porch. There's a reason. I have a brother, I'm 6 feet tall, I have a brother 6'10", 6'8". They never had the opportunity for a second impression. That first impression was, or they had to do the second impression. The first impression was always there. It was threat. And so being the way I was raised and the way I raised my 3 sons, African American, is very different than a way a lot of other people have to raise their sons. So that reality and being able to kind of navigate and to be open when there's so much risk and there's so much fear and pain and frustration, those are some of the deeper things that I think when we navigate this and we wonder, I just don't understand why people aren't leaning in while they're leaning back. It comes from some real historic and generational survival skills. And so as we look at where we are right now, let's talk a little bit about that. So how do we navigate that in a way in which we recognize people's perspective and a way in which we're trying to guide them to a more, quite frankly, healthier way and more productive way of basically individual survival as well as a collective survival?
First, I would say thank you, Judy, for sharing that story. And that's kind of where some of that bravery comes out, and the courage to put ourselves out there and to be vulnerable to one another. And there are some risks there too of how people can perceive different disclosures as well. And so I think that taps back into the safety piece. But that disclosure allows other people to then become a little bit closer, right? To see more of a humanist side around trying to understand what is that other person's lived experiences. And the more that we can try to cultivate a safe environment for people to have those disclosures, I think the better in terms of forming allies and really promoting that connectivity with one another.
I also, of course, I'm not a psychologist, I'm an attorney, so I would defer to you, Adam, but if we're really honest with ourselves, we should all realize that we suffer from affinity bias in many different forms. So if you don't open yourself up to experiencing different people, different backgrounds, different racial, educational, professional backgrounds, then you're stuck in this bubble of always being worried about something being different and different being the threat. That amygdala, the reptilian brain, it's always there, fight or flight. We need to move away from that, and that's where unexamined behavior, I think, is, to me, one of the major causes. And there is no reason for it in the 21st century.
So we have a question from Facebook Live, and one of the questions that we've been asked is, what advice would you give to young professionals about being an ally in the workplace? And I'll just kind of start it off. I think as a young professional, the most difficult piece is really the power differential. So many times as a young professional, you're not you're a frontline worker or early career, And so it's difficult to give feedback with someone that may be in management or they're senior to you. And so it's not just giving them feedback, but it actually may even feel like insubordination. So you're trying to figure out what is the best way to really give this this feedback that it can be received and I don't feel vulnerable. There's a couple different ways, and I'll just share a couple, and I'll allow my guests to also answer the question. One of the things I find is many times you almost have to give the person the opportunity, unless it's something egregious, to address it at a time where it wouldn't be confrontational. So if this is something that is happening in a meeting or something that is happening in a large group, that may happen, but then you pull the person aside later and bring to their attention, when you said this, it made me and possibly others feel that way, or that term is really derogatory, and I think I feel compelled to let you know that it means this. Sometimes giving people education, because you don't know what you don't know, and there's a lot of our language that comes from very colonial and based in a lot of sometimes racism. And there's things that, as an African American woman, that I've used terms like that because it was just a term that everyone used, and I used it too until somebody, made me aware of what it meant. So, I'll just start off with that is making sure that, sometimes if something has the ability to be addressed at a different time, which gives you the luxury of privacy and discourse to go back and forth. Sometimes that's the best, but not always.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah, it can be really challenging, especially for young professionals and even trainees, students, residents, medical students, to address some of these situations, especially when letters of recommendation may be tied to impressions and speaking out. So one I would say is knowing who you can go to, who you can trust. So if you can't bring that information forward to that faculty member, this other person who might be in a higher level of power, seeking out those that you might be able to share that information with, who can then advocate on your behalf. So it's seeking out allies that can then have your back and go to bat for you. I really love what you said, Judy, around that privacy, and that allows the person to become a little bit more vulnerable themselves to say, hey, this made me a little bit uncomfortable when you said X, Y, and Z, and here's why. Or I'm curious as to why you decided to address the situation in this way. So by having that level of curiosity, that can help lighten the approach to have some of those discussions.
That is so true in the workplace, in particular for young professionals. I think this is where allyship is key. So allies should build other allies, right? We can all be allies and you need them. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to go to the top management. But I think if you build your own support team, and, those of us who are more outgoing, we're in more power than those who identify as socially awkward. So as an ally, you can give power to those around you, the new employer who you just met, the students who just came to the class of 150 faces, came in late and didn't meet anyone. So I think in the workplace particularly, it's not necessarily taking it to the higher level, which is very important. But if you don't feel comfortable doing that, build alliances on your own level and support your team members.
And I think it's really important to what both you said is it's better to build an ally before you need an ally. I think sometimes things happen, you're like, oh my goodness, where's my ally in this situation? And just know that allies can be allies in different contexts. So you may look at something where it's more of a fairness or equity, and this is your ally. Or maybe something where it's more, where you're looking at access and communication, this is your ally. Or maybe it's someone where it's around access, promotion, tenure, or some level of how assessments are going, and this is your ally. So, in mentoring, they say research shows that the best network of mentors is each person should have 7, and that's because first and foremost, an ally is not, your ally, your mentor, your sponsor or coach. They're not always available, and they have bandwidth as to what their expertise is. So you want to try to think about, what are the resources that put you at full capacity, and think of, who are those individuals within that network that have the ability to really support me, give me the information, the language. And we're going to talk about mentoring, sponsoring, and coaching in a few minutes. But talk about the network.
Sure, building the ally network. I agree. I think that's really important to seek out who can help you and be supportive in different areas. The other thing that comes to mind is, as an ally and perhaps as a leader, being able to look at and see who is in need of allyship, right? So as in being in leadership roles, and we all have the opportunity, again, to be allies to others. And so how can we be aware of who's around us? How can we be mindful of the different things that you're observing, so that you can then be proactive, step up and say, hey, I'm going to choose to be an ally to that person or that group there.
If you're just joining us, I'd like to reintroduce my guest today. I have Dr. Adam Gonzalez and Juliet Passer. We are talking about allyship, both being an ally in allying, and how it actually can drive a high-performing organization and put people individually at full capacity. I kind of cut you off. I'm sorry there, Juliet. Would you like to respond?
Yeah, no, not at all. Adam, it's so, you're so right. I agree with you wholeheartedly that in the position of leadership and mentorship, and in the position of being professors and lecturers and educators, we do need to take that step forward and offer allyship opportunities, especially for our students, because if you look at where we are in society, the gender issue, the inclusion, the various disadvantages that so many groups bring with them. We are a diversified campus. I think it's so important for us to remember and to recognize that our students may be dealing with this intersectionality of various disadvantages, and they don't have yet that mentorship network. So we need to really be proactive, especially as educators. I feel very strongly that as educators, we must look at our students not just as 150 faces out there, but as individual students, and maybe take that extra time and effort to get to know our students.
I think it's important also to look at, people think that diversity and inclusion are the same thing. Diversity is really, having the perspectives and experiences and voices and skills and talents and information, individuals. But the inclusion piece is actually leveraging that in a way in which it is high performing, and it's productive, it's innovative, I think, Juliet, you talked about as far as it reduced risks, because when you bring in different perspectives, you have individuals that will see vulnerabilities that you may not, because your particular perspective may not have ever been experienced, something that may be a vulnerability. So can you talk a little bit about, inclusion? What is inclusion? What does that look like?
Mm-hmm. I think typically we think of inclusion as having a seat at the table, right? Having people join the group to be able to participate. So it's not just having a seat at the table, but being able and empowered to have a voice at the table. And so I think those two pieces are really key. And as you were saying, when we have inclusivity and we have these be able to get different perspectives, different cultural views, I think it makes for a much more rich learning, working environment, as well as the decision-making process of how we put different plans in place, policies in place, that we can really have it be a very multidimensional approach by getting all of these different views.
That is so true. Again, going back to the grammar, diversity is a noun, inclusion is a verb, right? So somewhere in my millions of readings, I came across this summary that diversity is inviting someone to the party and inclusion is asking them to dance. And I think that really summarizes that. So going back to the classroom, I think it's so important for us to actively invite the students to dance. And it could take many forms. You know, I know we all have the most precious resource personally is our time. But that's where that allyship and commitment and donation of your time means one student at a time, you know, one phone call, one meeting, one sponsorship, etc. And so as educators, we can do so much for our students. And it could, you know, it could be as simple as what I do in my classes, and I'm sure many of my colleagues at Stony Brook do that too. You can put together a simple questionnaire that each student should fill out, then you will then review and get a glimpse into each student's background, maybe their religious holidays, maybe the origins of their names, maybe what brought them to Stony Brook, and then you can start a conversation. That's allyship.
Absolutely. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I remember we were having some conversations about, and again, that like awareness, especially working with lots of a broad range of different students from different cultural backgrounds and the biases that we may bring forth. So, you know, in past conversations, thinking about the pronunciation of students' names from different types of cultural backgrounds, and for some individuals thinking, you know, I know best, I know how this person's name ought to be pronounced, versus asking the person and really respecting that other person. And I think we need to do more of that, and we have the responsibility as educators and leaders to do more of that.
So I always love when it's, you know, diversity, equity, or diversity, inclusion, and equity. So diversity is, you know, who's at the dance. You know, inclusion is being asked to dance. And then equity is what music is playing. And so when we think about equity, it's really interesting when people, they look at it in a way in which things need to be equal. And I really wish equity were more, or the term would be replaced and be fairness. And so when we think about equity, we think everybody should have the same, but not everybody has the same needs. So it really isn't equitable or even inclusive if I give everyone the same thing, because you have to understand the diversity of individual needs and so on is really around fairness. So when we think about equity, and I'm going to define that as fairness, so equity, fairness, what are some of the things that people need to be, because that's a self-awareness that you don't know everything you need to know. So when we think about equity and fairness, what are some of the language or behaviors, things that people should do to actually understand what's fair for others, not just equal?
Yeah, and just to clarify too, and maybe give an example around, like, so if we gave everybody this same amount of food, right, that might not be equitable because I don't have an oven to cook that food, and yet everybody else may have an oven to cook that food, and so now I'm stuck with this raw meat, right? So we can assume that what we're doing is equitable when we don't really know and understand what resources people have, what opportunities they may have access to. So I think being able to get a deeper understanding of others and what the needs are, I think is really important.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, and you're so right, Judy. I mean, equity and fairness really need to go hand in hand. Of course, if we step back, you know, fairness is also a societal construct. Yeah. So we have to be very careful. But I think on the overall, the good news is that we can influence our societal definitions and the society opinions and what is fair and equitable changes. So I'll give you an interesting example. In 1999, there was a research that a couple of universities conducted, and what came out is that only 27% of Americans supported same-sex relationships, and only 17% of Americans supported same-sex marriage, right? Now, fast forward to 2019, 73% of Americans support same-sex relationships, and 83% support same-sex marriage. And obviously, in 2015, Supreme Court made that the law of the land. So we can change. And
Yeah.
we can really adjust our understanding of fairness. And as a society, I think we have the responsibility to do that.
I think in order to do that, I think we need to be able to bring about greater visibility around what are some of the issues that we're facing. And I think that's where we're at right now, especially with the Black Lives Movement, and dealing with a lot of the racial tensions and racial oppression that's been here for quite some time, and we're being forced to look at that as a society, or look more closely at that. So that visibility, that attention and awareness and acknowledgement is really key.
One difficult thing, I think, that people grapple with is around power and relevancy. I think when you start to bring, let's just say, I always hear the pushback of, if we're going to diversify the room, that means I have to get up and leave, versus pulling more chairs to the table. I think that becomes one of the things of contention, is that my voice isn't enough, and hasn't. This is how we've always done it, so this has been working, and really, how do you get people hungry to really become more effective and efficient? And that all comes from, pulling more chairs up to the table, not necessarily pulling chairs from the table. And when we so as we're navigating people that aren't leaning in, they're like, okay, so the reason this works well for me is because I'm in a position of power and privilege, and it's kind of working well for me. But if you start to diversify what we do, how we do it, who we do it with, and when we do it, I may lose my power and I may be less relevant. So I'm really going to dig in to kind of maintain this status quo. So how do you address that?
Yeah, that is a hard one. So what you're tapping into is being aware of our own privilege, and trying to help people to really understand their privilege, their degree of power, their experiences that may have provided them with different opportunities than others. And that takes, I think, a lot of self-reflection around, similar to some of the points that Juliet was making earlier, around looking at, say, your network, looking at your resources, looking at your own personal trajectory. What schools did you go to? What neighborhoods did you live in? Did you have that iPad or Game Boy growing up? So being able to look at the different opportunities and resources that we have. And I know that can be a tricky piece too, when then the pushback sometimes is, well, I worked hard for those resources, right? And I worked hard for those opportunities. And that may be the case. And at the same time, when we look at the larger environment and we think about structural and systemic racism and oppression that has gone on for so many years, that some of our systems are broken, that they don't allow those opportunities for certain people. And that's what we have to look at changing.
That's true. And, I think in corporate world as well as in higher education, that my comment that the top-down approach doesn't work because it creates compliance and not commitment. Sometimes you won't be able to have a top management that's willing. And this is where allyship at grassroots levels means a lot, because you can disrupt that system. And if you have enough voices, and we have plenty of examples during the Me Too movement where top CEOs have been toppled because they just wouldn't budge in that, ivory tower of being in the C-suite. So it's a very complicated issue, but I think that's where each one of us comes in. You can create this allyship and start change one act at the time, one word at the time, one person at the time.
So we got a question, and the question is, how and why were these panelists selected to discuss this topic? Well, first of all, everyone is an ally, and everyone's going to be allied. And this is a continuous conversation that we'll be having throughout the entire academic year. And if you'd like to be on my show, please reach out to me, and I'd love to have you on. But the way that we're talking now and what we're talking about and who is an expert in this, we're all going to be an expert at any given time. And we all have a role and responsibility to create good information, knowledge, skills, techniques, tools. And that's how the panelists were selected. And I am thrilled to have these two individuals sharing their expertise and knowledge from their vantage points through their long careers and so on. So that answers that question. But
I could maybe
absolutely
Please talk a little bit about my own experiences here. I think personally, I've always felt compelled to help and support others, which is why I went into clinical psychology to begin with. And then I would say for myself, I think in my own self-reflection, have been raised and have gone through my different experiences that have helped to grow and promote my own level of self-efficacy. And self-efficacy, I think, is another really important thing that warrants further discussions. And so I've really have tried to take on being that voice and helping to advocate for others when I see injustices, when I see oppression. So, for example, as being the co-chair of our LGBTQ committee, also a gay man, that's really important to me, not only to be able to advocate and be an ally for myself, but also to be an ally for the community and really work to change policies, change procedures to help others. And then as it relates to some of the stuff that's been going on now with racial oppression, really working with our medical students were amazing to develop a solidarity event for Black Lives. And so I saw that and I said, you know what, this needs to have a voice and we need to push this forward, and got behind them and really helped to organize with them. So I think looking at some of the different opportunities that I have taken and as well as have been afforded to me to serve as an ally as well as to be allied has helped me to be in this chair right now.
I can only add that, I agree with you, and I've always wanted to help amplify other voices. I'm a first-generation American immigrant in this country, and I was not always in the position to be an ally. I relied on amazing mentors. What I do have to tell you is that I have been incredibly fortunate to have always really diverse and interesting people around me. It's just my luck, I suppose. And now I am just like you, Adam. I'm in a position to amplify the voices, and I do want to give back.
Love it. So we have another question from our listeners, and it's, what are some practices that we can apply in our daily lives to foster inclusive and more diverse communities? First and foremost is, I love the question, which means you're curious, you're open, you're self-aware. And I think really it's kind of taking personal inventory of where things, I always say, if it's comfortable, then it's rote, which means you're not learning, you're not growing. It's really important to me to have a level of continuous discomfort in which I'm always trying something. So I'm going to places I wouldn't typically go. I'm trying food I wouldn't typically try. I'm having conversations with groups that I wouldn't typically have. I'm watching movies and in closed caption because I'm watching what it looks like through cinema in a global perspective. I'm learning a new language. I'm going to the museum and going on the floors I wouldn't typically go on to learn about other people's history and art and their culture and so on. I think it's really the intentionality of wanting to be a lifelong learner and grow.
That was an amazing response. So in addition to some of those external pieces, also that, again, coming back to self-reflection and really that practice of mindfulness. So the more that we can practice being mindful of our bodies, of our environments, the more we can tap into how we're thinking, how we're perceiving others, and then make those steps to alter the thoughts that we're having, which then will lead to altered behaviors. So a level of self-reflection could help journaling as an example and writing down what your thoughts are, what your goals, values are, what's important to you is another way to be able to reflect on who am I as an individual and what do I want to bring forth to others.
Absolutely. You both just, summarized everything there is. So I can just add that you have to be inquisitive, just as you said, Judy. You have to be inquisitive. You have to ask questions and be willing to learn. And self-reflection is absolutely key. And, once you really look deep down, you might find some really uncomfortable truth out there, and you have to face it.
In addition, it's courage. One thing I learned in sport is I didn't necessarily run a race to win, but I wasn't afraid to lose. And so when I would go out there, I would go out there and try my best. If people who were less afraid of being wrong and less afraid of an outcome that's less than ideal, then they're willing to really have the courage to really expand who they know, what they do, how they do it, and who they do it with. That's, so it's okay to be clumsy. And I think when people know you're sincere and you're trying, your clumsiness will actually be something that's endearing because people will want to correct you and help you, and you have to be open to correction and feedback. And I think a lot of people can't accept criticism. So can you give all of us an advice on understanding and embracing criticism?
Yes. So when it's annual review time in my department, and so there's lots of feedback that's being given, and it can be really challenging to hear things that may sound negative, and if we reframe negative views and really look at areas for growth and growth points, I think that's a way of thinking about it differently. How can I empower myself to become a better person by being open to the feedback from others, and realizing that it doesn't have to be personal. And I think sometimes we make it really personal, and we choose to get defensive and perhaps not listen, and that listening and shutting others out, and that doesn't allow our own growth, nor does it allow other people to grow, because we may continue the same behaviors.
That's true. It's hard to take criticism. We all think we're perfect. We do everything right, and, everybody else is wrong. But that's, again, all I can say. You are what you think, and if you're not open to examining your own behavior, you're bound to make many mistakes.
Another question from our listeners: can a person's political or personal views inhibit them from being an ally? So here's my thought. People think that an ally is a friend. An ally is being a colleague, a good person. You can have opposite perspectives on things like this. You're with your colleagues. You don't have to agree on something. You don't have to have the same perspective. But you can respect that person's opinion without agreeing or disagreeing, and not recruit. I think that's the hardest thing, is when people have different perspectives, they always want to recruit the other person to their side. And so then it becomes, if I give you more information, you're more likely to think like me, and the person on the other side is thinking the same thing, and it just becomes this ongoing recruitment on thought. That comes with when we're talking about, respecting other people's perspective does not necessarily mean you have to embrace it and align with it. We can think differently. So if somebody has a different political view than me, then they do. That's not what defines our relationship, is our point of contention. We look at other things, and maybe some things are just off the table. We don't talk about certain things because we just
can agree to disagree.
Agree to disagree and agree to move on. So go ahead, Adam.
Oh, no, I was just going to say I've had many of those experiences where it can get to a place where we can agree to disagree, and that's okay. The being open to and being willing to have the conversation, I think, is important, and helps to also facilitate that connectedness. But it doesn't necessarily, again, like Judy, you were saying, it doesn't mean that you have to agree with that person, but you can listen to and validate where they're coming from.
Absolutely. I think healthy tension is the crux of allyship. You're not trying to find people who are similar to you, you're trying to find people who are different from you. So I think you have to do exactly the opposite. If you're really entrenched with some political ideas or some other ideas, find people that have exactly the opposite view and see if you can become allies.
And you also have to self-reflect, why do they have to think like you? So maybe some of the point is that may be problematic if you feel like everybody around you has to have your same. Now, I understand respect, core values, and things like that. So I'm not talking about diametrically opposite. But I think it's really important that you have a broad base of friends that have different perspectives. And I always say, you know, do you want to be right or you want to be a friend or an ally?
Yeah. I also think, Judy, about being allied, that comes with certain responsibilities too. And I know sometimes it can be difficult when we may have to, when we feel like we may be taking on a lot of the burden to educate others. Just want to point out that it's really important as being an ally that we do our own homework. And we dive into the literature, we dive into reading, we dive into the cultural foods, to learning ourselves versus putting that responsibility on the person that needs us.
Love it.
Absolutely, I agree. You need to understand the historical context, the social context, your own life's context to become an ally. Don't expect the person that you're trying to ally to educate you. It's your job as an ally to open yourself up to that discussion. Totally agree with you.
And I think that that's kind of that individual self-reflection and self-control because I think sometimes when people are talking, we're already thinking of the response or what we want versus really being present. It's really important, just like we say with children, it's like you really need to be present in processing the information that people are giving and sharing you in a way in which you're internalizing it to your own personal growth.
To be able to listen and really be there with that person.
Right.
Yeah.
I call it active listening.
Active listening.
Exactly. Yeah.
Oh, I love it. Oh, man. We're
just getting started.
We're just getting... and again, it's important for... I think to share that this is a continuing conversation, and this is as each of these podcasts will be touching on different things. And I love that we've had a lot of interaction with our listeners, sharing their perspectives and asking questions that, you know, directly will help their ability and capacity and skills and talents. This is how we grow, is we share. And every time I have a conversation, I learn something. And then I don't just hear it, I learn it. That's very different. I didn't just hear you. I incorporated what you said into my behavior, my language, and what I do. And that's a second step that it's important that everyone takes. Any comments?
I can't wait to follow up with you after this to hear more about your own background and history. So, yes.
I can only say practice the culture of inclusion for all, and the rewards will be measurable.
And I think that a diverse, inclusive, and equitable, it's actually easier work. Your work becomes easier when you have colleagues and input that is innovative and creative and leveraging and affirming and, you know, creates the opportunity to for people to be heroes. That happens, but that's all based on relationships. Mm-hmm. And allyship really is creating professional relations. We're not necessarily, you know, sometimes it's a bonus if it becomes a personal relationship, but many times it is professional relationships which make the work easier.
And we have to be willing to go there. And we all have to take those steps and be willing to make ourselves vulnerable to one another and to be willing to listen and to understand more so that each one of us can become better.
Absolutely.
I'm convinced allyship is very powerful. Try it.
It absolutely is. And I think that if we can, it's not just something that you do professionally, but you embrace it yourself. So thank you, Adam and Juliet, for today's conversation on allyship. It's an open, honest dialogue like this that gives us all, including myself, a hope for a better future. We all need to be a part of the conversation. We all need to take action. We all need to know that we have a voice that's heard and understood. Okay, until next time, thanks for joining us, everyone, on this edition of Beyond Expectation, Bridging the Racial Divide podcast. Good evening.